lesson 1, ipinakita kung paano mag-determine ng limits gamit ang table of values and graphs ng functions. Ang tanong, meron bang mas madaling paraan yung hindi kailangang gumamit ng tables and ng graphs? For today's discussion, we will enumerate and illustrate the 8 limit theorems. Bago yon, hello and welcome sa Mathaglish. Kung bago ka lang sa aking channel, ako si Ben Paul de la Cruz at layunin ko matulungan ng mga Pilipinong mag-aaral na mas maintindihan ng math. Ito ang learning outcome natin for today. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to illustrate the limit theorems. Okay? So for theorem number 1, if k is any constant, then limit of k as x approaches c is equal to k. So, hindi nagbabago, no? Yung limit ng k, laging k, kahit na si x ay nag-approach kay 0, kay 5, kay negative 7, kahit sino pa yung c. Basta ang limit ng k ay laging k. Okay? So, example, ang limit ng 5 as x approaches c ay 5. Ang limit ng negative 3.14 as x approaches c ay negative 3.14. Ang limit naman ng 789 as x approaches c ay 789 din. So, ang tanong, bakit ganun? Kung papansin nyo, ang f of x natin dito ay equal sa k. Pag nag-graph tayo, di ba, yung y natin yung f of x. So, kung si y ay equal sa f of x at itong f of x ay equal sa k, so y equals k, so yung graph ay horizontal line, ito ay isang constant function. So, ang constant function, hindi talaga nababago yung y, no? Yung f of x, kahit na anong value ni x. So, kahit sinong i-approach ni x, whether si 5, 2, negative 1 million, palaging yung f of x ay equal lang sa k, sa constant, no? Kaya ganyan. So, for theorem number 2, the limit of x as x approaches c is equal to c. Limit ng x as x approaches c. Ano ulit yung concern ng limit? Yung nilalapitan ng f of x as x approaches c. Pero yung f of x natin dito ay x. So, habang si x ay lumalapit sa c, ano yung nilalapitan ng f of x natin? Na equal din naman kay x. So, syempre, si c din. Tama? Yan. So, limit ng x as x approaches 9 ay 9. Kasi yung nilalapitan ng x habang si x ay papalapit sa 9 ay si 9. Okay? Ganun din dito, no? Limit ng x as x approaches 0.005 is 0.005. So, yung limit ng x as x approaches negative 10 ay negative 10 din. Okay? Ang y natin dito ay equal sa f of x. Ang f of x ay equal sa x. So, yung graph nito, nung y equals x, ay yung diagonal line, no? Ito. So, makita natin dito sa graph na yung nilalapitang value ni x ay yun din yung nilalapitang value ni f of x. Kasi equal sila. Okay? So, for theorem number 3, we have the constant multiple theorem for limits. Let limit of f of x as x approaches c be equal to L. Then, yung limit daw ng k times f of x as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa k times the limit of f of x as x approaches c. So, pag sinubstitute natin yung L dun sa limit ng f of x as x approaches c, ito ay equal lang sa k times L. Check natin, ano ba yung sinasabi nitong theorem number 3? Sinasabi nito na kung meron tayong constant multiplier sa f of x, tapos yun yung kinukunan natin ng limit, no, yung buong product ng k at saka ng f of x, pwede daw nating ilabas yung constant multiplier sa limit. Nakita nyo yun? So, tignan nyo to ha. So, tong k na constant multiplier na f of x, nasa loob to ng limit, lalabas siya, mapupunta dito. So, labas na siya ng limit. Okay, pwede daw natin gawin yon. Since equal sign to, kung meron tayong multiplier ng limit, pwede rin nating ipasok, no, yung constant multiplier dun sa limit. Example natin dito, kunwari yung limit ng f of x as x approaches c ay equal sa 4, then yung limit ng 8 times f of x as x approaches c ay equal lamang sa 8 times 4. Ito yung k times L, no? Pag sinimplify natin ay 32. So, kung meron tayong limit ng negative 11 times f of x as x approaches c, so sabi sa theorem, k times L lang daw to. So, yung k natin ay negative 11, ang L natin ay equal sa 4. So, negative 11 times 4 negative 44. Sa last example natin, kunwari yung k natin ay 3 halves. Again, yung L natin dito equal pa rin sa 4. So, by theorem 3, ito ay 3 halves times 4 lang, which is equal sa 6. Klaro ba yung theorem number 3, yung constant multiple theorem? So, kung klaro, diretso tayo sa theorem number 4. Theorem number 4, the addition theorem for limits. Let limit of f of x as x approaches c be equal to L, and limit of g of x as x approaches c be equal to m. Then, yung limit daw ng f of x plus g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang sa limit ng f of x as x approaches c plus limit ng g of x as x approaches c. Anong sinabi dito? So, kung kumukuha tayo ng limit ng sum, pwede daw ang gawin na lang natin ay isum yung mga individual limits. Kumbaga, in-split natin yung limit into two limits. Okay? Limit ng f of x muna and then plus yung limit ng g of x as x approaches c. So, sa case na to, ang limit daw ng f of x plus g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang sa L plus m. Okay? Sum ng individual limits. Although addition theorem to, included na rin dito yung sa subtraction. Kasi yung subtraction ay addition lang naman ng negative nila or ng inverse. Okay? So yung limit ng f of x minus g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa limit ng f of x as x approaches c minus limit ng g of x as x approaches c. So, ito ay equal lang sa L minus M, no? Kapag sinubstitute na natin yung mga limits. Yung idea, pag meron tayong limit ng difference, pwede nating split into two limits. So, magiging difference nung dalawang individual limits. So, examples, kunwari yung limit ng f of x as x approaches c ay equal sa 4. And then, yung limit ng g of x as x approaches c ay equal sa negative 5. Then, yung limit daw nung sum na f of x plus g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang sa, so split natin, sum nung dalawang limits, 4 plus negative 5, ito ay equal lang sa negative 1. Next, kapag difference naman, so kukunin lang rin daw natin yung difference nung dalawang individual limits. So ito ay equal lang sa 4 minus negative 5. Pag minus as negative, pwede nyo gawing plus positive yun, no? Gawin yung plus positive, so magiging 9 lang yun. Okay? For theorem number 5, we have the multiplication theorem for limits. Let limit of f of x as x approaches c be equal to L, and limit of g of x as x approaches c is equal to m. Then, yung limit lang daw ng product na f of x times g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa product nung individual limits. So, limit of f of x as x approaches c times limit ng g of x as x approaches c. So, kapag sinubstitute na natin, ito ay equal lamang sa L times m. So, example, if limit of f of x as x approaches c is equal to 4 and limit of g of x as x approaches c is equal to negative 5, then, yung limit ng f of x times g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa, so, product lang siya nung dalawang individual limits, which is equal sa 4 times negative 5, ito ay equal lang sa negative 20. Okay? So, we have a remark here. The addition and multiplication theorems for limits may be applied to more than 2 functions. So, pwede kahit 5 yung functions nyo, 10 yung functions nyo, 100 yung functions nyo, pwedeng gamitin to, no? In short, pwede nating i-extend. Dito sa illustration natin, since konti lang naman yung kasya sa screen, 3 functions lang gagamitin natin. Si f, si g, and si h. But take note, pwede kahit maraming functions, no? So, yung limit ng f of x plus g of x plus h of x as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa sum ng individual limits. So, 2 plus 6 plus negative 7. So, yun ay equal lang sa 1. And then, kahit sa products mag-work to, no? So, kunwari meron tayong limit ng f of x times g of x times h of x as x approaches c, then equal lang to sa product ng mga individual limits. So, ito ay equal lang sa 2 times 6 times negative 7, we have negative 84. Okay? So I hope naging klaro yun, no? Hindi siya limited sa two functions. Theorem number 6, the division theorem. Let limit of f of x as x approaches c be equal to L and limit of g of x as x approaches c be equal to m provided si m ay hindi 0. Then, limit ng f of x divided by g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa limit ng f of x as x approaches c divided by the limit of g of x as x approaches c. So, anong sinasabi dito? Yung limit ng quotient ay equal lang daw sa quotient nung individual limits. Okay? So, pag sinubstitute yung mga limits, ito ay magiging equal lang sa L over M. So, example natin, kunwari 4 pa din yung limit ng f of x and negative 5 pa din yung limit ng g of x as x approaches c. Then, yung limit ng f of x over g of x ay equal lang dito. So, limit ng quotient ay quotient lang ng limits. Substitute natin, ito ay equal lang sa 4 divided by negative 5, which is equal to negative 4/5. Kapag pinagbaliktad natin, limit naman ng g of x divided by f of x as x approaches c, so magbabaliktad lang rin yung fraction natin. No? Magiging limit ng g of x as x approaches c divided by limit of f of x as x approaches c. So, magiging negative 5 divided by 4 equal lang sa negative 5/4. Okay? Another remark, if yung limit ng f of x as x approaches c ay equal sa constant na L, pero hindi 0, no? Any constant maliban kay 0, tapos yung limit naman ng g of x as x approaches c ay equal sa m, tapos equal siya sa 0, then yung limit ng f of x divided by g of x as x approaches c ay hindi nag-e-exist, does not exist. Okay? So, non-zero constant sa numerator, 0 sa denominator yung limit. So, kapag ganon, hindi nag-e-exist yung limit. Okay? But, we'll discuss more about this in infinite limits. For now, does not exist yung isusulat natin. Theorem number 7, the power theorem. Let limit of f of x as x approaches c be equal to L and p be any integer, then yung limit ng f of x raised to p as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa limit ng f of x as x approaches c raised to p. Ano yung difference? Yung exponent na p dito sa left side ay exponent ng f of x. Pero dito sa right side, exponent naman siya ng buong limit. Okay? Kapag sinubstitute, ito ay equal lang sa L to the p. Pero may catch, dapat nag-e-exist yung L to the p. Okay? Kung di nag-e-exist, then hindi natin ito magagamit. Mamaya papakita natin no, kung kailan ba hindi nag-e-exist. So, sa ngayon, examples muna. Kung 4 yung limit ng f of x as x approaches c, then kapag yung p natin ay 3, then yung 3 na exponent ng f to the x, magiging exponent na siya ng buong limit. Equal lang daw sila, no? And ito ay magiging equal lang sa 4 cube, which is equal sa 64. Say, negative 2 naman yung p. So, magiging ganito lang, no? Magiging 4 to the negative 2, which is equal sa 1 over 4 squared, which is equal sa 1 over 16. Hindi mag-e-exist to kapag yung limit ng f of x as x approaches c ay 0, and then yung p natin ay negative. Bakit? Kasi ang 0 raised to a negative number ay undefined. Okay? So, sa case na yon, hindi gagana ang power theorem. Okay? So, for our last theorem, we have the radical root theorem. Let limit of f of x as x approaches c be equal to L, and n be any positive integer. Then, yung limit daw ng nth root ng f of x as x approaches c ay equal lang daw sa nth root ng limit ng f of x as x approaches c. So, dito sinasabi na yung limit ng nth root ay equal lang sa nth root ng limits. Pero take note yung condition sa dapat si n ay positive integer and dapat nag-e-exist yung nth root ng L. Okay? So, examples, if limit of f of x as x approaches c ay equal sa 4 and yung limit naman ng g of x as x approaches c ay equal sa negative 8, Then, yung limit ng square root ng f of x as x approaches c, and substitute natin, ito ay equal lang sa square root ng 4, which is equal sa 2. Then, yung limit ng cube root ng g of x as x approaches c ay equal lang sa cube root ng limit ng g of x as x approaches c. Ito ay equal lang sa cube root ng negative 8, which is equal sa negative 2. Okay? So, para sa ating last na remark, if n is even, and yung limit ng f of x as x approaches c ay negative, then we cannot use the radical root theorem. So, bakit? So, pakita natin. So, kunwari si limit ng f of x as x approaches c ay equal sa negative 4. Then, yung square root ng limit ng f of x as x approaches c ay equal sa square root ng negative 4 kapag in-apply natin yung radical or root theorem. Pero ito ay hindi nag-e-exist. No? Hindi kasi ito real number. Okay? So therefore, hindi natin pwede gamitin yung radical or root theorem. For our next topic, i-apply natin itong mga limit theorems natin para makapag-evaluate ng mga limits ng polynomial, rational, and then radical functions. So kung ready ka na for that, see you there! I hope nakatulong sa inyo. So kung na-appreciate nyo itong discussion natin, don't forget to like and subscribe and share this to your friends. See you next time!